The more I've run in this shoe, the more I've been impressed with this shoe. From a performance standpoint, but also I think what this shoe could represent for running shoes in general. Now, this is not a review of this shoe. I have a 100-kilometer review of the shoe on the channel already. I'll put a link in the description if you're interested in that. Instead, I want to unpack what I think is happening with this shoe, some of the design of the shoe, some of the engineering of the shoe, and really what I think is making the shoe special and why I think it may be the future of running shoes. The Superblast is really a uniquely Asics product. It's kind of a product that only Asics could really make right now. Now, one of the magic pieces of the shoe is that there's two foams put together. Every brand really has two foams right now. They have their primary super foam and then they have a training foam. Some brands have a few more in there. But Asics' two foams, FF Turbo and FF Blast Plus, I think are very unique in that they're very complementary to one another. FF Turbo being firmer, a little less resilient, sort of in the middle of the road of Superfoams, and FF Blast Plus being very soft, almost squishy, and not very resilient at all. And they're both extremely lightweight. So when you pair them together, they really complement one another. They really work well together, more than really any other brand that I can think of. So this idea of combining a super foam and a training foam together is not new. We've seen that in the Nike Turbo. Nike's done that before. And in that shoe specifically, we saw sort of a 50-50 mix of ZoomX and React, where they're sort of equally proportioned in the midsole. We also see things like in the Boston 12, for example, where you do still have an equal mix of Lightstrike Pro and Lightstrike 2, but it's more zoned, where in the forefoot you have more Lightstrike Pro and in the heel you have more Lightstrike 2. But in the Superblast, what we're seeing is more of this sort of 80-20, even 90-10 proportion of mostly FF Turbo with a little bit of FF Blast Plus to sort of smooth out FF Turbo, take some of the harshness away from it. And that combination of two foams is unique, and it is sort of special and unique to Asics in that only Asics' foams could really do that the way they're working right now. Additionally, I think there's another key design thing about the Superblast that's really setting it apart and really, I think, works for what the shoe's trying to do. And that is the molded midsole, the sculpted sidewalls of the midsole that really give it its stability, its inherent sort of structure. And this is something Asics has perfected over, 3 generations now of the Nova Blast. We saw them take that shoe from a max cushion trainer that was pretty unstable to something that is much more of a daily trainer that is, for the most part, pretty stable, relatively speaking. And Asics, I think, has really leaned in heavily here into the Superblast to do that. Those sculpted sidewalls, I think, really inherently make that shoe structured and really give it some of the rigidity that maybe traditionally a lot of other companies would have used a plate for. What I don't think is really the special part of the Superblast is the max stack of foam, the 45.5 mil of foam in the heel and the 37.5 mil of heel in the forefoot. I don't think that's what's special about it, because I think Asics could easily take the Superblast and make it race legal, put it under the 40 mil stack height limit that World Athletics has. And they could probably do it by not even changing how much FF Turbo's in there, just shaving off some of the FF Blast Plus that's really on the kind of outsole side of the shoe. And the more FF Blast Plus that you're going to shave off of this shoe, the more performance-oriented you're going to make it, the more you're going to move it from trainer into possible race shoe. Now, the design brief for what Asics was trying to accomplish with the Superblast was fairly simple. Their athletes were asking for a FF Turbo based shoe that had no plate in it, something that could be used for easy running, recovery running, and training that would complement the Metaspeed series. And I think they really nailed that. They really delivered on that brief, because they've delivered a performance trainer, not another daily trainer. Again, Asics already has, you could say 3 daily trainers in their line, from the Nimbus, the Nova Blast, and the Cumulus. They're all a little different, but they have that covered in their line. The Superblast was never intended to be another daily trainer, even though a lot of people do use it that way. And I think that's why it was priced the way it was. But they have created a shoe that is very performance oriented, that doesn't have, frankly, any compromise. It's a shoe that does everything really well, from easy running, recovery running, every sort of training, including workouts and speed work, to racing. And I don't think there's another shoe out there right now that can say that can do all that extremely well with no compromise. Now, Asics has said that they never intended there to be a Superblast 2, and this has been said on various Believe in the Run and Confuzi live streams, as well as I think it's come out in a few other places. And that doesn't necessarily surprise me, but again, I think the Superblast has maybe been a little bit more successful for Asics than they originally thought it would be, given how many other trainers and max cushion shoes that they have in their line. Now, this brings me to what is the future of the Superblast? So part of me says we could see a Superblast 2 now. Either Asics could have been lying about the fact they never planned a second version. I doubt that. But we could legitimately see a Superblast 2 that's very similar to the Superblast that we have now. The thing with Asics is they're not the type of company that just takes an older model, puts a new upper on it, and calls it a new version of a shoe. They just don't do that. When Asics comes out with a new version of a shoe, it's a new version of the shoe. And if they didn't intend originally for there to be a Superblast 2, and they didn't have the next model in sort of production and design, when this shoe launched almost a year ago now, that means there isn't going to be a Superblast 2 this year, even though I've seen that there is going to be a Superblast 2 on some of the release calendars this year. So again, we may see a Superblast 2. It could surprise us and come out this year. It could be something next year. It could be very similar to what the Superblast is now. And that would actually be totally fine. It's an amazing shoe, and I think it is warranted calling it a super shoe at this point. But what if, and I think this is where it gets much more interesting, what if Asics did something like created a Meta Blast or a Metaspeed Blast? Bear with me here for a moment. The whole stride runner versus cadence runner thing, I think, is a huge product marketing misstep that Asics did. I'm going to make a video about this specifically and go into it in depth because it's an interesting case study and what not to do, frankly. But for the sake of this conversation, I think that means the Metaspeed Edge is going to go away at some point. I think if you look at the sales number of the Sky to the Edge, the Sky probably, does 2 to 1, if not more, over the Edge. Part of that is how Asics markets the Metaspeed. It's always the Sky featured. But I think part of that is also the performance of the two shoes. The Sky is the better implementation of Asics technology. They're stiffer plates close to the foot with a big chunk of FF Turbo under it where you can really load it. And it is the ultimate sort of Asics FF Turbo race shoe. The Edge is essentially a Vaporfly clone, which just frankly doesn't work with Asics' foam and stiffer carbon plates. And I think you can even see that more directly with the new Magic Speed 3, which is a better Edge than any of the Edges we've seen thus far. So I don't think the Edge is going to stick around, which is going to leave a gap in the Metaspeed series. And I think we could begin to see maybe, like I said, a Meta Blast or a Metaspeed Blast, a companion shoe to the Sky series that is either the trainer companion that's still very capable with everything that it does, or the non-plated race version with the plated race version. Because again, I think you could take the Superblast, essentially put it into the Metaspeed Sky form factor, take the plate out, put a little bit of FF Blast Plus under it, and you've now got a very performance-oriented, capable race shoe that has no plate in it. Now, it's not as simple as that, obviously, and I think there's some stability things. You couldn't just take the Metaspeed Sky and call it a Superblast. As well, you couldn't just take the Superblast and call it a Metaspeed either. But I think that's probably what we're going to see, and I think that's how we're going to see this evolve. And I don't think this is coming out of the blue, because remember, the original design brief or the design ask for the Superblast was their athletes wanted an FF Turbo-based recovery and easy day training shoe to go, parallel and be a companion to the Metaspeed series. We've also seen this from, other brands. In this book, Kixology, there's a chapter that covers the Vaporfly, specifically the 2016-2017 era, right at the end of development and right in the early launch. Now, I've talked about this before on this channel, but there's a paragraph in that chapter that talks about how even up to the very end, Nike was prototyping a Vaporfly, or what became the Vaporfly, one with a plate and one without a plate. And Nike abandoned the one without the plate for reasons which I'll get to in a bit, but a lot of their athletes were actually kind of sad or a little upset about not having that non-plated sort of super shoe anymore, because they really like that. Now, Nike did come out with the Turbo, and according to this book, the Turbo was that non-plated version. I don't think I necessarily buy that, but we've seen Nike sort of attempt that. And I think now we see Asics really, truly doing it. And I think they're doing it in a really interesting way. So if they do evolve the Superblast into a Metablast or a Metaspeed Blast, that now positions not only the Superblast or whatever it becomes named, where it is meant to be, a trainer, not a daily trainer. It's a performance trainer made for training for racing. So that will now justify the price. But I think if you put it as a companion to the Metaspeed Sky, it now is a much clearer Metaspeed series where there's the trainer and the racer, or the non-plated and the plated version. That's a much easier story to tell from a marketing perspective, from a usability standpoint, than what they have right now with the Sky Plus and the Edge Plus. So if we step back a little bit, let's leave Asics land and let's talk about the running industry as a whole. Let's go up to the macro level. We can look at where running shoes are right now, and I think there is a change coming. And I think one of the signs of this is the whole super trainer thing that has been inflicted on us by running shoe brands' marketing departments lately. That, I think, is a sign that we are reaching the peak of the super shoe thing, because that means all of the super shoe technology has been commoditized. And frankly, if you look at any of the main running shoe brands, their super shoe foam and super shoe tech and plates are all across all of the shoes in the line. Some more than others, but it's all been trickled down to every shoe in the line for the most part, which means it's been commoditized. We're sort of at the very pinnacle of this technology, which means something new is going to be coming. If you really think about it, if we're ending the peak of the current cycle, the whole super shoe, plated, super foamed era, one of the reasons this era started the way it did, and like I said, Nike was developing really up to the end of the prototyping phase for the Vaporfly, a plated and non-plated version. They went with the plated version because that was a much easier story from a marketing perspective to tell. 4% from a marketing perspective is an easy story to tell. Whether, your average runner cares about 4%, runners looking for PRs in races definitely do. And Nike knew that. Also, the carbon plate is a marquee technology very similar to, say, Nike Air. It's something that can be very identifiable for a brand like Nike. That is probably, I would say, the main reason they went with the plated version over the non-plated version of the super shoe. Sure, there's probably performance gains. Sure, with the current Zoom X phone they had, back in 2016, the plated one was probably better. Because remember, you add plates to shoes to add stability. There is the propulsive effect of it, but something that's a very soft, very resilient, very bouncy foam like Zoom X kind of needs the plate to structure it, especially the Zoom X that was around in 2016, 2017. So Nike had a very clear marketing story to tell, and when the 4% launched, it made a lot of sense. Everyone understood it. Even if it wasn't their thing, they didn't think it mattered to them, they understood it. And I would say that's also one of the problems with the super trainers right now, is that it is very marketing driven, but there's no clear message. Every brand is sort of telling a little different thing, and it often feels from most of these brands that it's just tech for tech's sake, because they're looking to kind of cash in on the end of this current, trend or era that we're in with the super shoes. But I think the Superblast really does represent a next step. I do think it's an easier story for brands to tell now around performance, around foams being very performance oriented. After 6 to 7 years of the super shoe thing with Superfoams, runners understand this and they get it. So that's a much easier story to tell now than it was 6 to 7 years ago, which is why I think you will begin to see non-plated trainers, because again, the elite and pro athletes want it. There's a lot of studies out there saying that not every runner benefits from a plated shoe. And that's not necessarily about speed. It could be gait. It could be how your foot strike is. There's a lot of reasons why you may not benefit from a non-plated shoe, but we just haven't seen any true race options that are non-plated shoes since the 4% came out, because everyone was rushing to basically copy the 4% from Nike. And that's what we've got. And it's really just, again, hitting its pinnacle in the super trainer thing right now. But Asics with the Superblast has gone a different direction. Another thing that has been seen out there, there are leaked images of a Nike Turbo 3 being, run tested. Now this is, I think, particularly important because this shoe could be the Turbo Next Nature 2, or it could be truly a Turbo 3. But what we are seeing in it are two key details. The shoe does have the original turbo layup of ZoomX on the top and React or React X below it, or some other foam below it, and it's sort of an even mix of the two foams. It's unclear what the secondary foam is, but it's clear that it's two foams. It's not the recycled thing that's in the Turbo Next Nature currently. And the form factor, meaning the stack height of the shoe and the profile, the silhouette of the shoe, looks very much like a Vaporfly 3, meaning it's a much higher stack than the original Turbo was. If Nike is going back to the Turbo, and they had a bunch of reasons why they left it, and that's probably a story for another video somewhere else. If Nike's going back there, that means everyone else is going to go back there. Asics is an innovator in the running shoe space, but Asics is always off doing their own thing, even now. But everyone looks at what Nike's doing, and then everyone kind of clones what Nike's doing. So if the Turbo 3 is coming back, we have the Superblast out there. That is, I think, really where we're headed next for super shoes. Now, that may not be the only direction. That may not be the final direction. I do think in 2 to 3 years from now, we will see a substantial change in running shoe tech. I don't think plates are going to go away either, but I do think we're going to see new foams. I don't think it's just going to be PIBA, TPE foams. I think you're probably going to see something new, and it's going to significantly change running again. But this non-plated sort of super shoe with the current foams we have, or evolutions of the foams, because again, every brand is coming out with new foams, new versions of foams. We're seeing it across every brand right now. That could be the half step to get there. And I think that is why the Superblast is so important, so interesting, and so relevant right now in running. Thank you for making it to the end of the video. If you find this content interesting, consider subscribing. More content like this will pop up in your feed. If not, drop a like on this video because it helps this channel continue to grow, which I always appreciate. And with that, I'll catch you in the next one.